First of all, I just want to thank Joan and the team for the invitation to come to speak to you tonight and to congratulate them on such a well-organised and champion event. I know the group for a while now, and it is really one of the most impressive voluntary groups that I've interacted with in terms of the sincerity of their approach, the efficiency of their organisation, and the impact of their message. And I think they really do stand the opportunity or hold the opportunity to break new ground and have an impact far beyond Northern Ireland and the way in which the things are done and the way in which progress is made. But time is against us a little bit, so let me just talk to you about what I'm going to be saying tonight. I've spoken to different patient groups and different agencies in the past, and I think there's a variety of people here tonight. Some of you will know quite a lot about what I will call, for the purposes of the presentation, MECFS, and that's the term that NICE are currently using while the nomenclature is worked out. So some of you will know quite a lot, some of you won't know that much. And some of you will know the background to the evidence discussion, and some of you will know less. We've just heard how important it is that the review is taking place at NICE level for the treatment guidelines for what is MECFS. But if it were as simple as let's look at the evidence and decide what to do, we wouldn't be in the situation we're currently in. Many people have a certain fear of controversy. And there is no doubt that the story around the evidence base for treatment, certainly in the UK, for MECFS, that treatment that currently revolves around CBT and GET, cognitive behaviour therapy and graded exercise therapy, that is a controversy. And the average person who isn't involved in the controversy will probably side with the clinicians, the so-called scientists, and the notion of evidence. And when they hear that there is evidence to support something, they will assume that that is enough. What I want to talk to you about as a psychologist is a little bit more about the human factors around how evidence is created and how it travels and how it defends itself from controversy when controversy arises. You're probably, and I'll just say this as at the end of my opening remarks, you're probably aware that this controversy then can create interpersonal hostility, group polarization, and what have you. And very quickly, the argument isn't about what the evidence shows. The argument is about your tone in how you are bringing your point forward. So you have all of this talk about we're being harassed by patients, we're being bullied by patients, instead of actually engaging with the core points involved. I'm going to elaborate a little bit about that in general terms, and I'm going to talk about the human error component that creeps into the research pipeline. And I'm going to break it down into three stages. First of all, I'm going to talk about human factors in medical and healthcare research more broadly, because this isn't just an MECFS problem. It is particularly pronounced with MECFS, but it is easier for us to understand when we have a bigger picture and a bigger understanding. And for some of the researchers involved who are defensive about what is said, for them to understand that it's not personal to them. It's not a personal criticism of their moral integrity. This is a wider discussion about the pipeline that produces medical and clinical research and the problems with that pipeline. And people shouldn't necessarily take that personally. I'm obviously going to present the case of MECFS as a particular focus, and then I will give you some implications and conclusions. Because I think there is progress to be made with an engagement with this type of approach. Many people assume, for example, and I know medical professionals are quite aware that they're not everything is perfect. But general consumers, readers of newspapers and so on, patients, their families, their social networks, and it has to be said, a lot of clinicians, they assume that medical research is the best pipeline we've got and clinical research will give us the answer and we should stick with that, we should follow the evidence. And they don't always realise that things are never as clear-cut as they seem. And for a long time, actually, there's been a concern about reliability in medical research. Medical research is not perfect. No research is perfect, but I will just talk about medical research for the moment. Right back to the 1950s, people realised that when you do a study to show whether a drug works, you might not get the correct answer. There began to be a structure around what was required to maybe make the research a bit more sound. It was in the 1960s that the FDA said that really you need to have at least 2 studies to show something before we can rely on it. The whole notion of replication began to be talked about. But then there were other problems involved in various research areas. The idea of systematic reviewing, meta-analysis and so on was kind of pulled together in the 1970s. In the 1980s, there were standardized methods for assessing the quality of a clinical trial so that you give it a score. The medical journals issued statistical guidelines because there were a lot of statistical errors. And then the whole concept of an international registry of trials was developed. In the 1990s, the consort guidelines were published as a way of telling people how to report a randomized control trial because they weren't doing it effectively before that. In the 2000s, the medical journals made a requirement that trials be pre-registered. And then there was a paper I will talk about in a moment by John Ioannidis about false findings. And in 2010, there was the whole issue about the Open Science Forum, a sort of an organization looking at the replicability of different areas of research. Now, you might say that a field where there are so many innovations to try to improve research reliability, that this must be a good field. But another way of looking at it is there is something about research generally and in this area that creates problems because all of these innovations were responses to problems that had been identified. And there are still problems to solve, and we're still working on ways of doing that. I'll very quickly go through some pictorial slides. I don't want you to focus on the details. I just get a sense of the picture. Clinical research is fraught with an error rate, and that's part and parcel of life. 82% of phase 2 drug trials fail. In other words, what seemed like a reasonable thing to do actually turned out not to have been effective. And 50% of those trials, it's efficacy rather than cost effectiveness or safety issues that caused the trials to fail. So with the best judgment, a clinician in this type of medical area will have a sort of a hit or miss rate in terms of their prediction of what they think will work versus what won't work. When trials are published in medical journals, you might think that would fix the problem. Once it gets into the medical journal, it must be true. But pharmaceutical companies, when they decided to look at their own in-house data and compare it with what appeared in the journals and slice and dice the data indifferently, there are actually massive inconsistencies with data that resides inside the company compared to data that appears in the medical journal. And when Bayer, the German pharmaceutical company, tested its data set, its in-house data set, compared to what is published in journals, they found a 65% inconsistency rate. So that they were not necessarily, what appears in the journal is not necessarily what appears in the data set itself. There's a leak in the pipeline, if you like, that causes contamination. And when these researchers in Bayer, the pharmaceutical company, were asked, why is it that what appears in medical journals might not be reliable, they said that, well, there's immense competition among laboratories and pressure to publish. And that causes imperfections in the quality control system, to put it more broadly. There's a bias towards publishing positive results because it is easier to get positive results accepted in good journals. So in psychology, we've seen this a lot, that there is a bias towards interesting findings or impressive findings or encouraging findings. but that what appears in the journals is not necessarily representative of the real world. And that's a big problem for any form of scientific research and publication. We want to record what happens in the real world. We want to learn from the real world and build a scientific understanding. I've mentioned that all throughout the last number of decades there have been many initiatives to try to improve the quality of clinical research and how it's reported, but not all of those initiatives work. So one of the initiatives is reporting guidelines. The medical journals insist that you must report randomized control trials in a particular way. And just this year, a research team led by Ben Goldacre established that actually most medical journals don't follow their own guidelines. They publish the guideline, but when you actually assess the studies, they found that only 13% of studies in the top medical journals actually report the findings in the way they're supposed to do to fix the problem of unreliable reporting. So even in an area that is regulated and policed, it doesn't necessarily mean that what appears in journals will be error-free. And to broaden it out a little bit, this is any research area will find this paper interesting, or this type of paper interesting. But John Ioannidis, who was a leading medical researcher in the US, caused quite a stir back in the day. It was about 10 years ago. And he published why most published research findings are false. And this was an assessment of the literature, but also the dimensions of what makes a study reliable or not. Without getting into the mathematics of it, there is an element of probability in the reasoning of a statistical result. And that creates all sorts of chaos. And to simplify matters, Ioannidis established that studies were far more likely to be unreliable if they had certain features. And these are the features here. If you're looking for a small effect, it's very likely you'll have a false positive result published in a journal. It's not certain, but it's likely. If your research area takes a scattergun approach to statistical analysis, when you try everything and publish the bit that worked best, that creates a high likelihood of a false positive. A methodological flexibility, uncertainty around definitions, poorly understood or disputed or controversial subject matter, areas where researchers have biases, and I'll talk about this a little bit in a moment, and then areas where researchers are competing to publish quickly, where there's a rush to publish. All of these elevate the likelihood of a false positive result. And based on a kind of a statistical model, Ioannidis established that more than 50% of findings are probably not reliable, and therefore more than most published research findings are false. Now, nobody has disputed this assessment. In fact, there's a wide acceptance that this is generally a problem that we're trying to deal with in all sorts of ways in clinical research. The big problem, of course, is that when you pick up a journal or when a study is presented to you, you don't know which half it's in. Is it in the half that's reliable, or is it in the half that's unreliable? It's hard to say. And in areas where psychology is involved, and in ME/CFS, there's, as I mentioned, cognitive behavior therapy is a psychological intervention. Graded exercise therapy is also based on a behavioral intervention, so you have to understand the person's psychology and the wider diagnostic context for that treatment, as we will go on to see, is also a psychological theory. Psychology research and psychology interventions are also subject to this. And I was presenting this almost as a consumer awareness initiative, because most people outside the world of science and science publishing are unaware of how leaky or how ropey the whole system is. Unfavorable outcomes are much less likely to be published. So if you conduct a study of a CBT study and you find no therapeutic value for CBT, that's more likely to not end up in a journal than a study that does find a therapeutic effect. And that's a big problem, because that means that the journals are not representative of the wider reality. Even in areas, so 1 in 4 NIH-funded depression trials are not published. 2015. So even though you have pre-registration, it doesn't necessarily mean the study ends up published. CBT alone, if you account for missing studies, unpublished null findings, they actually inflate the effect by close to 60%. So the effect of CBT interventions for any area are likely to be inflated by around 60% based on the ratio of published to unpublished data. And a thing called outcome reporting bias, some researchers have looked at that, and the way in which people selectively focus on findings that are particularly encouraging. 1 in 5 meta-analyses results lose their significance when outcome reporting bias is taken into account. And that's another inflationary effect. So these are human factors, because not all bias is sinful. Not every researcher publishes a finding dishonestly. Just if it is wrong, it is wrong usually by error. People see things erroneously and publish that. They're not out as some conspiracy to try to create a false data set or a false evidence base. And that is what I'm trying to get at here. Now, undoubtedly, there are rogue practitioners in every profession. But I would say that if you take the totality of clinical research, the more defensible interpretation is that there are human factors that limit the error, that create error and limit the reliability of the research. It's not that people are trying to pull a fast one by publishing something that cannot ultimately be relied upon. There was a big stir in psychology more broadly, more recently, and those of you in the psychology profession might be aware that there's this replication crisis, as we call it. I'll show you a picture, and I'll tell you the depiction on the left. You don't have to be a statistician to understand this. The picture on the left is a visual depiction of the results of studies when they were originally conducted. And the picture on the right is a picture of the same studies when they were conducted as a second time, and the findings are just completely different. The findings are all over the place, you might say. They go from the bottom of the chart to the top of the chart, and that's a reasonable explanation of the finding. What these researchers found when they replicated 100 studies is that in most cases they could not be replicated. In 2/3 of cases, the significant finding was found not to actually be significant upon replication. So there's human error in the research pipeline. And I want to talk a little bit about the factors in research, the human error factors in particular, and the ones I will mention are as follows. There is a thing called therapeutic allegiance. And this is, with the best of intentions, if you are a cognitive behavior therapist or a therapist in a particular field with a particular orientation on attitude to therapy, you are more likely to find that your therapy works than an independent replication or an independent investigator. We'll have a look at some data on that. It's an issue of confirmation bias. We're all subject to it, including researchers and peer reviewers and grant awarding agencies and medical journal editors. And people end up talking in echo chambers. They talk to themselves, and that's a big problem in the MECFS world. There's a thing called white hat bias, and I was interested to learn what white hat comes from, because I often heard the term, but only recently understood that the white hat refers to the colour of the hat the cowboy used to wear, the good guy in the old cowboy movies. So the hero wears a white hat and everybody else wears a black hat. White hat bias is when you take a rose-tinted look at research evidence and conclude the therapy worked. When you feel that you have intervened and you must have done something good, and therefore what is it? And you go looking at your data and you generously interpret ambiguous data and conclude that the therapy worked. That's called white hat bias. There is a problem with non-independent replication. I'll look at some data in a moment. And there's a wider issue called the third person effect, and that is the ability to be self-aware about researcher error, or indeed any error. The third person effect is a biased blind spot. All of us are guilty of it to a certain extent. We all have greater faith in our own judgment than other people's judgment. We all believe ourselves to be relatively capable of resisting bias, but we all overestimate the capacity of other people to succumb to bias. So the third person effect, it's studied in a lot of different fields, but we all think we are reasonable and the other people are gullible. That is and if you're a researcher and somebody comes along and says, you've done your research badly, there's an error in your study, or at least there's an ambiguity in your study, one's natural reaction is to say, no, I did my study well, you're the one who's making the error, you're misunderstanding the research. That might sound familiar to some of you. Okay. Therapeutic allegiance, I'm going to show you a picture. Okay, that picture is quite complicated, but that's a funnel plot for those of you who know how systematic reviews and meta-analyses data are presented. Generally speaking, this has been studied lots of times, but the conclusion is if you do a study on your favorite therapy, you're more likely to show a big effect, and if somebody else does a study on your favorite therapy, they're less likely to show a big effect. So most people's therapeutic allegiances are published, they're in the public domain, and if you're a cognitive behavior therapist, you're more likely to find a strong effect for cognitive behavior therapy than a non-cognitive behavior therapist. There are loads of studies that look at this. Every study on a therapy, you can link to the researcher's allegiance. And when you actually do the reviews, there's a strong effect that shows that the effect sizes for an RCT on a psychotherapy can be considered a non-financial conflict of interest. If you have a preference, that should actually disqualify you to an extent from being an arbiter of what happens with that evidence. That evidence has to be handled independently. A final point to make on this section is simply to say that most research is not actually replicated. Most replications that are so-called are not really replications. They're different studies that are done on a similar topic, but with a different methodology. So if the finding is the same, everybody celebrates, and if the finding is different, they say, well, different methodology. So you win either way. So there's a non-replication rate that's a problem, and the bigger problem, perhaps, is the non-independence of replication. And when in psychology and in psychotherapy and behavioral intervention research, when studies are replicated independently, the fail rate of that replication is around 20%. But when studies are replicated by the same researchers that conducted the original study, the fail rate is almost non-existent. So there's a big issue there, and it's a human factor. It's part of the psychology of being a researcher. You're less likely to find fault with your own research. That shouldn't be surprising, but it is surprising the extent to which it comes up in the ME-CFS debate. Okay, so let me get down then to brass tacks in terms of the ME-CFS issue. How does all of this come up? And the example I'm going to use, because it is the elephant in nearly every ME-CFS room, and that's the PACE trial. So this is the large-scale study conducted in the UK. You can argue that it is the largest clinical-based psychology intervention research study in terms of research funding, about £5 million, ever conducted in the UK and possibly in many other countries too. And it is a study that, as I will go on to show, has a number of issues. But it was conducted a number of years ago. It's grounded in what some people have called the dysfunctional belief theory of chronic fatigue syndrome. It's CFS is the term it uses. And this is the theory that CFS is itself the result of unhelpful cognitions and dysfunctional beliefs, where patients are seen to be hypervigilant to normal bodily sensations, and where symptoms result from deconditioning and dysregulation caused by sedentary behavior and stress. So this is a psychosocial theory of the condition that many of you have been diagnosed with. And the argument is, although people will dispute this, the argument is ultimately that it is the consequence of cognitive dysfunction. So the reason you are ill is not because you have some physiological dysregulation. It's because you have ultimately made yourself ill unintentionally by your thought pattern. And the way in which we can intervene is to address that core problem. Now, you don't need me to tell you that is a local theory. That is not a theory that's held in all countries, but it's the dominant theory in the UK, and for that reason it influences lots of other service countries and researchers and so on. But it's by no means the central theory of this condition. Nonetheless, keeping it on the PACE trial, the study was conducted over a 5-year period. For the benefit of people who haven't encountered this trial before, it involved 641 CFS patients. There were multiple arms to the study. Everybody was followed up after a year, and the researchers who conducted the study reported that there was positive change in fatigue and physical function for graded exercise therapy, which is based on teaching you how to exercise appropriately given your physical deconditioning, which after all is the result of self-harm in a sense, that you have shied away from conditioning, so you've become deconditioned, and we can show you how to get back your fitness and how to exercise appropriately. And CBT, we can address those dysfunctional thought patterns that have created this problem in the first place. And they said that there was positive change, and that, in fact, in a second paper, that 22% of patients recovered using those two treatments. So it was a cure. It's not only something that helps you live your life, it was pitched as a cure. And this isn't the only study that NICE took into account, but it was the study to beat all studies. It was the biggest ever study. It was intended to be, if you like, the final word for a generation, a bit like the Brexit referendum. We all saw how that worked out. It was supposed to settle the matter once and for all, and this is how this is its role now. But as has been mentioned, those guidelines are now being reviewed, and I would have just a professional, conscientious type concern that job needs to be done very carefully, because it is a controversial space, and the issue of the human factors of research need to be considered, because there are human failings here that have created the controversy, and I'm not absolutely sure that the NICE procedures are designed to take account of those types of controversies. So it is something that is worth advocating for. It's not intended to be hostile. It's not intended to be attack on other researchers. But it is intended to raise awareness that if you just look for data and if you just look for journal articles, that isn't sufficient to resolve the uncertainty. Because the people who are producing the journal articles and indeed the data they're susceptible to certain types of biases. The PACE trial in particular had many significant issues, and I will go through 3 of them only today, but there are many, many issues involved that are kind of surprising. And for those of you who haven't heard these before, I ask you to bear with me, because you might not actually even believe me. Okay. The biggest problem perhaps with the PACE trial is the lack of blinding, and this is a design problem. Not every study in the world is blinded, but certain studies have to be blinded. And studies relying on self-report data by their nature, and I say this to you as a psychologist and as a methodologist and as a healthcare researcher, studies requiring self-report data require blinding, and blinding is you don't contaminate the expectancy of the participants by telling them what's going to happen. Any study that involves self-report data will be contaminated if blinding is not achieved. The PACE trial, although perhaps it didn't intend to, it ultimately relied heavily on self-report data. But the PACE trial did not employ blinding. That's a major design flaw. So ultimately, and I don't want to oversimplify matters, but the researchers told the participants that their therapy was going to work. They didn't tell them, you are in an intervention, but we're not telling you whether you're in the target intervention or some kind of control intervention. They actually gave these participants quite a lot of information and guidance and told them what was going to happen. And then they asked the participants what happened. And that biasing factor is a significant problem in any study. It takes many forms in PACE. And in a perfect world, you wouldn't tell participants that they are in the target group. You would say, you're receiving an intervention that might or might not work. What the PACE trial authors told the participants is, you're receiving an intervention that will work because it's evidence-based and it works for everybody else. And it's working so far for all these other people. They gave them updates. They sent them newsletters in the post telling them that how the study was going and how good the therapy was. And before the study was completed, they described the study as evidence-based when interacting with the participants in the GET and CBT groups. They also gave those participants more contact hours than the other groups. So there are lots of ways in which participants were created, where expectancies were created. And then they relied on self-report data, which it taps into those expectancies. And we can also add, CBT as an intervention is designed around teaching people to find benefit in their situation and to understand their predicaments differently and to talk positively about them. So to teach people to look at the jar as half full. So when you actually use that intervention, that accentuates the problem because you're essentially telling a group of participants, this therapy is going to work, and the therapy involves reinforcing participants to look on the bright side of things. And then at the end of the study, the finding essentially is there a bright side? Is your jar half full? And they all said yes. Okay. Now, I want to introduce a group called the Science Media Centre. These are a private company that promote science understanding to the general public. And they call upon scientists to do all sorts of ways. And I'm going to do this here, and I hope you don't find it unfair ultimately. The reveal comes at the end. But here's something the Science Media Centre have said recently, this year, about blinding. A study was published in the British Medical Journal, not on ME/CFS, and not on the PACE trial, or CBT, but nonetheless, the study had a flaw, and they produced a press release with experts saying this study is embarrassing, we shouldn't have this study. And it has been established for at least 70 years that blinding is an absolutely essential part of clinical trial design, and it's deeply shocking that the British Medical Journal should publish a trial in which patients were aware of which group they were in. That's what the Science Media Centre said about a study of acupuncture on menopause symptoms in February 2019. Spoiler alert, they don't say that about the PACE trial, but there's a reason, and we'll mention that a little bit later. The second problem with the PACE trial, an error, and I'm not saying that the lack of blinding, incidentally, just to cap the point, I'm not saying that's because the researchers were trying to fool everyone. It's just that the researchers made an error in their design, they didn't realize it, and they went to production with it, and they published data with it. And they've spent the subsequent years rationalizing it after the fact. Okay, they made an error, and it's human nature to rationalize it after the fact. Here's a different one, and this is sincerely revealing. There was also the problem of moving goalposts. So, like all studies that was pre-registered, the researchers had to publish in advance what they were going to do. And they said that they were going to measure recovery in a particular way. On the physical function scale, you had to have a score of 85. On the, I'll do it this way. But then, when they published the paper in the journal, they decided halfway through the study, when they saw some data, that they were going to change things. So they ultimately decided, no, we're going to classify recovery if you have a score of 60 or higher. So that means it's easier to be recovered, okay? The study was approved ethically and funded on the basis that the fatigue score for recovery had to be 3 out of 11, equivalent to 27 out of 100. They decided, without giving the money back, that they were going to change that to 18 out of 33, 55 out of 100. Again, it's easier to recover because the target is easier. The self-reported status had to be very much better. They said, no, much better will do. They changed it halfway through. And the case status, they said that you had to recover according to all of the diagnostic systems on this list. But then they said, no, we're going to count you as recovered even if you only recover according to one of those diagnostic systems. So they made it much easier for patients to be classified as recovered. Now, if somebody did this, a company that was supplying you with a washing machine or something, decided that we're going to lower all the quality control indexes to show you that this washing machine is really effective at cleaning clothes, as a consumer, you would rightly complain to the relevant authorities, and you wouldn't accept that. But this is the style of adjustment that was there. Now, the researchers will say they did this on expert advice, but what does that mean? They advised each other. And they did this for good reasons, but what does that mean? They're good after the fact in their own opinion. And what effect did this have? Well, remember, the researchers went to press with the finding that 22% of patients had recovered. But when the data were ultimately published, and that's another psychodrama, when the data after freedom of information requests and court hearings were released, despite the journals requiring this to be done as a matter of course, Independent analyses showed that on the originally intended recovery criteria, only 7% of the patients recovered, which is more or less the same as the control group. It's a little bit higher, but not significantly higher. So there was no effect based on the original criteria, a massive effect, an unbelievable effect, physical illness cured by cognitive behavioral therapy for 1 in 5 patients, based on the new criteria that just happened to be easier to achieve. To me, okay, I'm going to stick to my line. The researchers are not trying to fool people, but they are possibly fooling themselves unintentionally. They're rationalizing after the fact. The study didn't work, as students like to say. All studies work, even if they don't find a finding. That's the reality that's just found. But nonetheless, the study didn't work in the cliched sense, so they changed the criteria, they moved the goalposts until it did work. To me, that's a human failing, and it's rationalization after the fact. This is slightly tricky, but you can consult the paper that's referenced at the bottom of the slide, because what it means is, if you bear in mind that the fatigue score back at the beginning there, 85 was required to recover originally, but then they lowered it to 60. Actually, 65 was required to be diagnosed, to be sick enough to take part in the trial. So it was technically possible to start the trial at 65 to be diagnosed as sick, and end the trial at 60 and be declared to have recovered, even though your score went down. And 13% of the participants in the GET, in the trial overall, 13%, 1 in 8 of the participants' scores went down on that measure, and yet they were declared as having recovered and as being human evidence for the effectiveness of the treatment that was received. Now, you might think that's enough to have a paper retracted, but it's not, because people will say, well, we took a lot of things into account. That's just one factor. We measured recovery lots of ways. And yes, okay, we made a mistake there, although they didn't actually come out and say that exactly. They're willing to kind of roll with the punches and stick to their guns anyway, to mix all my metaphors. Okay, let's keep it going here, because that's really restating the point. The entry criterion to be declared sick was higher than the score to be declared normal afterwards. Okay, so self-report data, remember, is prone to bias anyway. So even if they didn't move the goalposts, there would have been a problem. But moving the goalposts is a real problem. But I understand this as a psychologist. I think this is a human failing of researchers, and this is why independent replication is so important. Suffice to say, self-reported data is fraught with error, or fraught with risk of error at the very least. But the interesting thing about the data set for the PACE trial is that it wasn't all self-report data. Some of the data was objective measurements of physical abilities, physical tolerances. The problem with that is it showed no effect. So the objective physical activity scores showed no effect for GET or CBT, but they stand on the record, albeit a record extracted as a result of a court proceedings, but nonetheless they stand on the record in the public domain. The journal talks about subjective fatigue. So the patients said they felt less tired, although some of them were more tired than at the start of the study, but nonetheless they were declared to have recovered even though the objective physical tolerances were no better. In fact, the walking ability of the patients classified as recovered was so poor, it was equivalent to the walking ability, the number of meters per minute you could walk was similar to a person requiring a lung transplant. So people were in quite a decrepit physical state, according to the available objective physical data. And another way of looking at this is that after the PACE trial, the patients who were apparently treated well, or who recovered, actually had higher disability payments rather than lower. So the objective data are informative. And an interesting thing to do would be to compare the whole lot of the data in the round, and to think about what does it mean that the subjective and objective data diverge so much. But that's not what has happened, unfortunately, with the PACE trial. What we have seen is kind of group polarization, people defending their study and accusing their critics of harassment rather than engaging in a discussion of the issue. Okay, I mentioned therapeutic allegiance. I don't wish to be in any way defamatory or unfair. I have pixelated the names concerned. But there were 3 main researchers who are in charge of the PACE trial. And the PACE trial, remember, is a study of cognitive behavioral therapy, and they found that it works, even though there are major methodological problems with it. Okay, one of the researchers, one of the three, published a book and had a lot of papers as well, saying cognitive behavior therapy is a good therapy, back in the 90s. Another one published a book in the 2000s promoting the same logic. Another one even promoted cognitive behavior therapy for chronic fatigue, specifically in 2005, before the PACE trial even was started. So these people have already committed themselves publicly to a belief, a view, that CBT works for things like CFS. And if their study contradicts them, what would any human being do in that situation? Hopefully, we would like to think that we would rise above that and admit our error. But unfortunately, that's not how things work. There are human factors in play, and we see it across the medical literature, and that's why independent replication is essential for good science. Let me talk to you a little bit about then the conclusions, just to wrap up why I think this is all important. To declare my own allegiance, if you like. Okay, you might say I have a book out, and in that book I talk about chronic fatigue syndrome as a case study in the replication crisis of psychology. It has all the features that cause problems for research. So I just put that there. I didn't pixelate my own name. It kind of defeats the purpose. But you can read more about it there if you wish. But it is a study that actually stands as a good case study. It should be a learning opportunity for professional scientists and regulatory agencies. Okay, but how does medical science communication really work? And again, one of the areas that I look at as a psychologist, maybe from a slight distance in some of the core issues, there are problems all over the place in how science communication works. Last year, Cochrane withdrew a review that was understood to be problematic, saying that exercise therapy is good for CFS. And there was an element of kind of celebration or rejoicing. There was positive feedback to Cochrane for doing that from the patient community, from clinicians, from scientists. But then they put it back again. They put the review back again. And the researchers were all over social media talking about this vindicates us. The Cochrane have put back our study. Exercise therapy is good after all. The technicality, however, is, according to the Cochrane's procedures, if they're required to put back a review if the authors themselves complain about it having been taken down. So it wasn't a revelation that Cochrane suddenly understood that actually they'd made a mistake. They just were bound by their own procedures to restore the review to its original status because of the author's objections. Earlier this year, the Health Research Authority wrote a letter to an MP with a report describing the PACE trial as well conducted. And then again, people were all over social media saying, look, it's vindicated. The PACE trial is a beautiful study. I've heard that description used. It's a beautiful study, that one of the authors said. But the Health Research Authority stated in its report, in its statement, it said that the focus is on research ethics approval and transparency of record keeping, which is kind of funny in its own way, but and that the issues of study quality, which they say, we understand there is controversy, but they are outside our regulatory remit and we can't comment on study quality. So it is misleading for people to use the HRA saying the study was well conducted, quote unquote, as a defense of the methodology, because they didn't mean it like that. They were talking about the paperwork was well filed. That's as far as they went with it. But I do think it's important for regulatory agencies to understand that this is the nature of the discourse. There is claim and counterclaim, but we cannot assume that the eminent clinicians are always perfect and that the amateur patients are the ones making the mistakes, because some of it is spin doctoring. It's fake news. Just this month, or last month, the BMJ published a revised risk of bias tool for evaluating research, which people think that must be really useful because it actually addresses the things I'm talking about. And we can throw that into the mix for any nice review to kind of evaluate which are the good studies and bad studies, which are the biased ones and unbiased ones. But the lead author of the risk of bias tool is himself associated with controversial therapy research and research in ME/CFS, as it happens, using something called the lightning process, which involves neurolinguistic programming. And if you're not familiar with the world of pseudoscience, you can go look that up in all sorts of reviews and things like this. This is a controversial therapy by definition, by name. It's got lightning in the title. This is a medical treatment we're talking about. But the author there he's the person who has designed the risk of bias tool, which the next thing you know, people are going to say, well, the risk of bias tool says the PACE study is fine. Because the risk of bias tool says it doesn't matter if you don't use blinding, which it literally does say that. That's not a big problem, the risk of bias tool says. So the risk of bias tool is itself biased, but because of human factors. Okay. And remember, earlier this year, and I'll kind of close with this little kind of vignette, online activists are silencing us, scientists say. So there's a big concern in the modern world about fake news and people being skeptical towards science. You think of vaccination or climate emergency and so on. The idea that there are people who say the scientists are renegades, those anti-vaxxers and climate change deniers, they're characterized as a kind of a lunatic fringe. Well, in my view, and I'll put this concisely, it seems to me that the bubble of people at the center of PACE and related approaches are using that narrative to accuse their critics of being a lunatic fringe. Okay, they're accused them of being anti-science rather than good at critically evaluating a methodology. Okay, so this study, this news story appeared in lots of places in March this year. Reuters carried the study. The journalist who wrote the study has previously worked with the Science Media Centre to an extent that the Science Media Centre use her as a kind of a person from whom they have quotes in their annual report saying how great the Science Media Centre is, so they obviously work well together. The Science Media Centre has a list of 10 governance trustees, and I've pixelated them as well. And 9th on the 10th list is somebody associated very closely with the PACE trial. So the Science Media Centre have people in their governance structure who are personally loyal to the PACE trial. And when a news study appears in the media saying, the criticism of the PACE trial is unfair and we're being harassed, not criticised, this isn't an academic discussion, it's cyberbullying. They say things like that. It's hard to unpick the fact that there's a conflict of interest there that should really be declared. And remember, the Science Media Centre, when it comes to acupuncture, are quite happy to say that it's absolutely unacceptable that blinding isn't a part of a clinical trial. But when it comes to the PACE trial, the Science Media Centre have a file of news of press releases saying the PACE trial is great and that people should stop harassing the researchers, one of whom is on the board of governors of the Science Media Centre. So I don't want to be a nihilistic or a cynic, but I want people to be consumer aware. And I particularly want NICE and regulatory agencies like NICE, especially at a point where the guidelines are being reviewed, to be mindful of the distortions here and in the narrative, because those distortions won't disappear on their own. And there is a very high chance, I think, of the dynamic being that the clinicians will continue to stick to their guns and, I would say, talk down to non-clinicians, and that the criticism from scientists and clinicians in other countries will be somehow batted away. And I think that a greater awareness of the human failings that we all are subject to. There is a real-world consequence of this because it's in the air, the modern discourse around anti-science skepticism and the lunatic fringe and the people who are generating fake news. So I think it's very unfortunate that story that emanated from the Science Media Centre ended up in the mainstream media with a narrative where patients were the lunatic fringe and the poor scientists were defending good science. I think that's a very misleading narrative. And it doesn't take much for mainstream commentary to spill over into a sort of shock jock type commentary. And the next thing you know, one of the UK's most controversial columnists is taking up the cause of the scientists, talking about these crazy patients who think they're sick, but they're not really sick because it's all in their minds. So the positions that scientists take to defend their own studies against criticism have real-world consequences. That information doesn't exist in a bubble. It filters out into society. And the next thing you know, you have a patient group who are vilified and ostracized and laughed at by the mainstream population. And it's not fair. And I would put it to you in moral terms, it's simply not fair. But human failings are what they are. And the human factors in research are at the root of this. And we're all subject to them. And one of the messages I will finish with is to say that if you think your study is perfect,